third characteristic is not self or emptiness. The word that we translate as empty comes from the Sanskrit word shunya, or emptiness is shunyata. The word shunyata begins with the compound shu, which is a verb, which means to swell. It's how you refer to somebody who's pregnant, is they're swollen. Right? They're swollen with life. So, emptiness is very misunderstood as a term. Shunyata means that everything is so swollen with everything else that there is no such thing as a thing. Do you understand what I mean by that? It's like when I inhale through my nose, at what point does the breath stop being air and become Michael? And does anybody want to put their finger up my nose and try and feel, right? Or it's like if I go to Nick's down the road. Have I mentioned Nick's yet? If I go to Nick's down the road and I get an espresso.
How much did Nick pay you?
At what point when I'm drinking the espresso does it stop becoming espresso and actually become my body? Right. So when you start to meditate on these things, you start to see that there isn't such thing as a thing. That everything that's a thing is part of a vast web that is so much bigger than that thing. And then you see the same is true for yourself. Your sense of self is dependent on your culture's understanding of gender, of your own experience of yourself that's been internalized from your family and your upbringing, the stories that you tell yourself based on your joys and your wounds and your fears and your ambitions. But when you really look closely, there is no thing in the middle that is me. So there's two really important things about this. One, that you don't exist the way you think you exist. Okay? Number two, this is the tradition's critique of religion. The tradition's critique of the idea of a soul. That we think that deep down in us there is something that doesn't change, that continues in time and space, and then when you die, it's reborn. Both the Buddhist tradition and the yoga tradition use the teaching of emptiness to critique that assumption in religion. Saying that if our moment-to-moment experience is a conditioned phenomena coming and going, right? Just like, remember the diagram yesterday of the 6 kinds of consciousnesses coming and going? Where inside that is the soul? You see?
Where is it?
So the Buddha called the teachings of emptiness not self, which has been misunderstood as no self or no soul. It's not saying that there is no soul, it's just saying that there is not self. Do you see that? Because if you said, oh, well, there's no thing there, well, that would be just like reverse theology, saying, oh, well, there's no soul. You see? So when you have pain arise, you can see how the pain arises in conditions. The conditions change. But there's no thing in there that is the core of the pain. This is such a relief, I think. At first, it's kind of intellectual, like, what? I don't exist. So in Western philosophy, there are 2 words that help describe this. One is called ontology, and one is called epistemology. Or I also call it psychology. So psychologically, there is a sense of self. We have a story about us that we relate to and come back to, and it's healthy to feel a sense of self. But ontologically, there is no such thing as a self. You can't find it. And there's a really good story about this student who's so confused when he hears this teaching. His name is Vajragota. And he goes to the Buddha and he says, "Please tell me, is there a self or is there no self? Just tell me once and for all." And the Buddha remains silent. So Vajragota leaves, and he thinks the Buddha doesn't know what he's talking about. And the Buddha has this right-hand man, who is my favorite character in the Buddhist tradition, named Ananda. And I always like Ananda because he's the only person in the community who doesn't get enlightened in the Buddha's lifetime. And so Ananda starts feeling really bad that Vajragota imagine if you're like the Buddha's right-hand guy and someone asks a question and then they leave, you'd start to feel, oh. So Vajragota goes after, or Ananda goes after Vajragota and says, "Vajragota, don't leave. The Buddha, he really does get it. Just pay closer attention." And so Vajragota says, "Okay, well, what did he mean?" And Ananda says, "I don't know." So Ananda goes back to the Buddha and says, "When Vajragota said, 'Is there a self or is there no self?' why didn't you answer?" And the Buddha says, "If I said that there is a self, it goes against my teaching. That all things are conditionally arising, right? Everything is interdependent. And if I said there is no self, then he would think that there is no self. But there is." Do you see what he's getting at? So that's why I like translating it as not self. That nothing is I, me, or mine. Nothing. No thing. And so the reason why it gets translated not as swollenness, but as empty, because what it's saying is that emptiness is a strategy that you use to see. It's a lens you use to see that there is no thing, right? Something is empty. Empty of what? Empty of an inherent substantiality. So, those are the three characteristics. Dukkha, impermanence, and not self. And what interests me is, how do you build a life out of those teachings rather than creating a whole theology based on your past life, your future life, how the world was created, what's going to happen when you die? Is there a soul? Is there no soul? Is the body the same as the soul? Is the body separate from the soul? Is the mind part of the body? Like all these questions we ask. But actually those questions are all a distraction in a way, and should be put in brackets and put to the side. That those are not actually the questions that help you live a life. They all will just give you new stories. And those stories become old stories. So the teaching is not that stories are bad. The teaching is that a story becomes suffering when you don't see the story as a story. And that's what we do personally. We don't see the stories we have about ourselves as stories. And what's beautiful about meditative practice is even if your technique is so-so, the stories start falling away. The second place stories don't work is that we have stories about other people. And when we don't see that our theory about someone is only a theory about someone, love gets compressed and fragmented. So, because love only arises in the absence of you framing somebody or something, you see. And third is countries have fixed stories about other countries, which makes it really easy to kill people. And until nations can recognize the stories they're superimposing onto other nations, then they can't have insight into the compassion that allows for a more interdependent reality, because they think their stories are real.